The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. This book tells a story about ourselves and the world, and about how we got to be where we are now. While much of it is about the structure of the human brain, the place where mind meets matter, ultimately it is an attempt to understand the structure of the world that the brain has in part created. Whatever the relationship between consciousness and the brain, unless the brain plays no role in bringing the world as we experience it into being, a position that must have few adherents, its structure has to be significant. It might even give us clues to understanding the structure of the world it mediates, the world we know. So, to ask a very simple question, why is the brain so clearly and profoundly divided? Why, for that matter, are the two cerebral hemispheres asymmetrical? Do they really differ in any important sense? If so, in what way? The subject of hemisphere differences has a poor track record, discouraging to those who wish to be sure that they are not going to make fools of themselves in the long run. Views on the matter have gone through a number of phases since it was first noticed in the mid-19th century that the hemispheres were not identical, and that there seemed to be a clear asymmetry of function related to language, favoring the left hemisphere. At first, it was believed that, apart from each hemisphere obviously having sensory and motor responsibility for, and control of, the opposite, or contralateral side of the body, language was the defining difference, the main specific task of the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere was considered to be essentially silent. Then it was discovered that, after all, the right hemisphere appeared better equipped than the left hemisphere to handle visual imagery, and this was accepted as the particular contribution it made, its equivalent to language. Words in the left hemisphere, pictures in the right. But that, too, proved unsatisfactory. Both hemispheres, it is now clear, can deal with either kind of material, words or images, in different way. Subsequent attempts to decide which set of functions are segregated in which hemisphere have mainly been discarded, piece after piece of evidence suggesting that every identifiable human activity is actually served at some level by both hemispheres. There is, apparently, vast redundancy. Enthusiasm for finding the key to hemisphere differences has waned, and it is no longer respectable for a neuroscientist to hypothesize on the subject. I believe there is, literally, a world of difference between the hemispheres. Understanding quite what that is has involved a journey through many apparently unrelated areas, not just neurology and psychology, but philosophy, literature and the arts, and even, to some extent, archaeology and anthropology. I have come to believe that the cerebral hemispheres differ in ways that have meaning. There is a plethora of well-substantiated findings that indicate that there are consistent differences, neuropsychological, anatomical, physiological and chemical, amongst others, between the hemispheres. But when I talk of meaning, it is not just that I believe there to be a coherent pattern to these differences. That is a necessary first step. I would go further, however, and suggest that such a coherent pattern of differences helps to explain aspects of human experience, and therefore means something in terms of our lives, and even helps explain the trajectory of our common lives in the Western world. My thesis is that for us as human beings there are two fundamentally opposed realities, two different modes of experience, that each is of ultimate importance in bringing about the recognizably human world, and that their difference is rooted in the bihemispheric structure of the brain. It follows that the hemispheres need to cooperate, but I believe they are in fact involved in a sort of power struggle, and that this explains many aspects of contemporary Western culture. Freud anticipated that making connections between experience and the structure of the brain would be possible once neuroscience became sufficiently evolved. A neurologist first and foremost, he believed that the mental entities that he described, and whose conflicts shaped our world, the ID, the ego and the superego, would one day be more precisely identified with structures within the brain. In other words, he believed that the brain not merely mediated our experience, but shaped it too. We can look at the brain's evolution in the same way we think of our body organs having their origins in the ancient past. The other founding father of psychoanalysis, Carl Jung, had concluded that, just as the human body represents a whole museum of organs, with a long evolutionary history behind them, so we should expect the mind to be organized in a similar way. We receive along with our body a highly differentiated brain which brings with it its entire history, and when it becomes creative it creates out of this history, out of the history of mankind, that age-old natural history which has been transmitted in living form since the remotest times, namely the history of the brain structure. This book has nothing to offer those who would undermine reason, which, along with imagination, is the most precious thing we owe to the working together of the two hemispheres. My quarrel is only with this excessive and misplaced rationalism which has never been subject to the judgment of reason, and is in conflict with it. I hope it will not be necessary for me to emphasize, too, that I am in no sense opposed to science, which, like its sister arts, is the offspring of both hemispheres, only to a narrow materialism, which is not intrinsic to science at all. Science is neither more or less than patient and detailed attention to the world and is integral to our understanding of it and of ourselves. The brain is, in fact it has to be, a metaphor of the world. Chapter 1. Asymmetry and the Brain. Why two hemispheres? Why are there two cerebral hemispheres at all? After all, there is no necessity for an organ whose entire function, as it is commonly understood, is to make connections, to have this almost wholly divided structure. Over the course of the long evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens, there could have been developments towards a unified brain, which might on the face of it offer enormous advantages. It is true that the brain's embryological origins lie in two distinct halves, but this cannot be the answer, not only because, earlier still, the primitive hemispheres themselves arise from a single midline structure, the prosencephalon, at about 5 weeks gestation, but because midline structures and connections between the halves of the brain do develop later in fetal development at some levels, even though the hemispheres themselves remain deeply divided. And the cranium, which encases the brain, begins in the embryo in several pieces on either side of the brain to end up as a fused whole by the end of gestation. This is not the case for the brain itself. Instead, we see a positive tendency to enhance separation. For a long time, the function of the corpus callosum, the main band of neural tissue that connects the two hemispheres at their base, was thought to be no more than a kind of bolster to stop the hemispheres from sagging. Now we know that it is there to allow the hemispheres to communicate. It contains an estimated 300 to 800 million fibers connecting similar areas in either hemisphere, yet only 2% of cortical neurons are connected by this tract. Furthermore, the main purpose of a large number of these connections is actually to inhibit, that is, to stop the other hemisphere interfering. Even though neural inhibition may produce a functionally permissive net result, evidence shows that the primary effect of callosal transmission is to produce functional inhibition. So much is this the case that a number of neuroscientists have proposed that the whole point of the corpus callosum is to allow one hemisphere to inhibit the other. You might think that as brains evolve to become larger, the interhemispheric connections would increase. But that is not the case at all. They actually decrease relative to brain size. The bigger the brain, the less interconnected it is. Rather than increasing connectedness, evolution appears to be moving in the opposite direction, and there is a close relationship between the separation of the hemispheres on the one hand and the development of the asymmetry of the hemispheres. Because it turns out that the greater the brain asymmetry, the smaller the corpus callosum, suggesting that the evolution, both of brain size and of hemisphere asymmetry, went hand in hand with a reduction in interhemispheric connectivity. And In this respect, the modern human brain's twin hemispheres have been characterized as two autonomous systems. Is there a purpose for the division of the brain? If so, what could that be? The asymmetry of function. Questions about the meaning of structure have answers, but in order to understand them, we need to take a closer look at function. In fact, the phenomenon of functional differences between the hemispheres goes a long way down phylogeny, far further than anything like language or handedness, and that is what we would expect from the fact that the structurally divided, bihemispheric brain is not a new invention. Bihemispheric structure must have offered possibilities that were adaptive. Lateralization of function is widespread in vertebrates. It is even true that some of the same neuroendocrine differences that characterize the human brain, differences in neurotransmitters or neurohormonal receptors between the hemispheres, are already present in the brains of rats. We have merely taken this whole process much further. So what is the advantage to birds and animals? Animals and birds may not have the problems posed by our frontal lobes to deal with, but they do already experience competing needs. This can be seen at one level in terms of the types of attention they are required to bring to bear on the world. There is a need to focus attention narrowly and with precision, as a bird, for example, needs to focus on a grain of corn that it must eat, in order to pick it out from, say, the pieces of grit on which it lies. At the same time, there is a need for open attention, as wide as possible, to guard against a possible predator. That requires some doing. It's like a particularly bad case of try and rub your tummy and pet your head at the same time, only worse, because it's an impossibility. Not only are these two different exercises that need to be carried on simultaneously, they are two quite different kinds of exercise, requiring not just that attention should be divided, but that it should be of two distinct types at once. If we pull back a bit from this same distinction between focused attention and open attention, we could see it as part of a broader conflict, expressed as a difference in context, in what world we are inhabiting. On the one hand, there is the context, the world, of me, just me and my needs, as an individual competing with other individuals, my ability to peck that seed, pursue that rabbit, or grab that fruit. I need to use, or to manipulate, the world for my ends, and for that I need narrow focus attention. On the other hand, I need to see myself in the broader context of the world at large, and in relation to others, whether they be friend or foe. I have a need to take account of myself as a member of my social group, to see potential allies, and beyond that to see potential mates and potential enemies. Here I may feel myself to be part of something much bigger than myself, and even existing in and through that something that is bigger than myself. The flight or flock with which I scavenge, breed and roam, the pack with which I hunt, the mate and offspring that I also feed, and ultimately everything that goes on in my purview. This requires less of a willfully directed, narrowly focused attention, and more of an open, receptive, widely diffused alertness to whatever exists, with allegiances outside of the self. These basic incompatibilities suggest the need to keep parts of the brain distinct, in case they interfere with one another. There are already hints here as to why the brain may need to segregate its workings into two hemispheres. If you are a bird, in fact, you solve the conundrum of how to eat and stay alive by employing different strategies with either eye. The right eye, left hemisphere, for getting and feeding, the left eye, right hemisphere, for vigilant awareness of the environment. More generally, chicks prioritize local information with the right eye, left hemisphere, and global information with the left eye, right hemisphere. And it turns out, not surprisingly, that chicks that are properly lateralized in this way are able to use these two types of attention more effectively than are those in whom, experimentally, lateralization has not been permitted to develop. Many types of birds show more alarm behavior when viewing a predator with the left eye, right hemisphere, are better at detecting predators with the left eye and will choose to examine predators with their left eye. to the extent that if they have detected a predator with their right eye, they will actually turn their head so as to examine it further with the left. Hand-raised ravens will even follow the direction of gaze of a human experimenter looking upwards, using their left eye. For many animals there are biases at the population level towards, again, watching out for predators with the left eye, right hemisphere. In marmosets, individual animals with more strongly lateralized brains are better able, because of hemisphere specialization, to forage and remain aware of predators. There are shorter reaction times in cats that have a lateralized paw preference. Lateralized chimps are more efficient at fishing for termites than unlateralized chimps. Even individual human brains that are, for one reason or another, less lateralized than the norm appear to show global deficits. In a word, lateralization brings evolutionary advantages, particularly in carrying out dual attention tasks. As one researcher has put it succinctly, asymmetry pays. In predatory birds and animals, it is the left hemisphere that latches on, through the right eye and the right foot, to the prey. It is certainly true of familiar prey. In toads, a novel or unusual choice of prey may activate the right hemisphere, until it becomes familiar as an object of prey, when it once again activates the left. In general, toads attend to their prey with the left hemisphere, but interact with their fellow toads using the right hemisphere. The advantages accrue not only to the individual. Being a more lateralized species at the population level carries advantages in social cohesion. That may be because the right hemisphere appears to be deeply involved in social functioning, not just in primates, where it is specialized in the expression of social feelings, but in lower animals and birds as well. For example, chicks preferentially use the left eye, right hemisphere, for differentiating familiar members of the species from one another, and from those who are not familiar, and in general for gathering social information. Chicks approach their parents or an object on which they have imprinted using their left eye, right hemisphere, as do Australian magpies, though black-winged stilts peck more, and more successfully, at prey using the right eye, left hemisphere. Males are more likely to direct courtship displays to females that are seen with their left eye, right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the main locus of early social experience in rats. In most animal species, intense emotional responses are related to the right hemisphere and inhibited by the left. In general terms, then, the left hemisphere yields narrow, focused attention, mainly for the purpose of getting and feeding. The right hemisphere yields a broad, vigilant attention, the purpose of which appears to be awareness of signals from the surroundings, especially of other creatures, who are potential predators or potential mates, foes or friends, and it is involved in bonding in social animals. It might then be that the division of the human brain is also the result of the need to bring to bear two incompatible types of attention on the world at the same time, one narrow, focused, and directed by our needs, and the other broad, open, and directed towards whatever else is going on in the world apart from ourselves. In humans, just as in animals and birds, it turns out that each hemisphere attends to the world in a different way, and the ways are consistent. The right hemisphere underwrites breadth and flexibility of attention, where the left hemisphere brings to bear focused attention. This has the related consequence that the right hemisphere sees things whole, and in their context, where the left hemisphere sees things abstracted from context, and broken into parts, from which it then reconstructs a whole, something very different. And it also turns out that the capacities that help us, as humans, form bonds with others, empathy, emotional understanding, and so on, which involve a quite different kind of attention paid to the world, are largely right hemisphere functions. The nature of attention. Attention is not just another function alongside other cognitive functions. Its ontological status is of something prior to functions and even to things. The kind of attention we bring to bear on the world changes the nature of the world we attend to, the very nature of the world in which those functions would be carried out, and in which those things would exist. Attention changes what kind of a thing comes into being for us. In that way it changes the world. If you are my friend, the way in which I attend to you will be different from the way in which I would attend to you if you were my employer, my patient, the suspect in a crime I am investigating, my lover, my aunt, a body waiting to be dissected. In all these circumstances, except the last, you will also have a quite different experience not just of me, but of yourself. You would feel changed if I changed the type of my attention. And yet nothing objectively has changed. So it is, not just with the human world, but with everything with which we come into contact. A mountain that is a landmark to a navigator, a source of wealth to the prospector, a many-textured form to a painter, or to another the dwelling place of the gods, is changed by the attention given to it. There is no real, in inverted commas, mountain which can be distinguished from these, no one way of thinking which reveals the true mountain. Science, however, purports to be uncovering such a reality. Its apparently value-free descriptions are assumed to deliver the truth about the object, onto which our feelings and desires are later painted. Yet this highly objective stance, this view from nowhere, to use Nagel's phrase, is itself value-laden. It is just one particular way of looking at things, a way which privileges detachment, a lack of commitment of the viewer to the object viewed. For some purposes this can be undeniably useful, but its use in such causes does not make it truer or more real, closer to the nature of things. Attention also changes who we are, we who are doing the attending. Our knowledge of neurobiology, for example, of mirror neurons and their function, which I will touch on later, and of neuropsychology, for example, from experiments in association priming, which again we will have time to consider in due course, shows that by attending to someone else performing an action, and even by thinking about them doing so, even, in fact, by thinking about certain sorts of people at all, we become objectively, measurably, more like them, in how we behave, think and feel. Through the direction and nature of our attention, we prove ourselves to be partners in creation, both of the world and of ourselves. In keeping with this, attention is inescapably bound up with value, unlike what we conceive as cognitive functions, which are neutral in this respect. Values enter through the way in which those functions are exercised. They can be used in different ways for different purposes to different ends. Attention, however, intrinsically is a way in which, not a thing, it is intrinsically a relationship, not a brute fact, it is a how-ness, a something between, an aspect of consciousness itself, not a whatness, a thing in itself, an object of consciousness. It brings into being a world and, with it, depending on its nature, a set of values. Chapter 2. Breadth and flexibility versus focus and grasp. If what it is that exists comes into being for each one of us through its interaction with our brains and minds, the idea that we could have a knowledge of it that was not also an expression of ourselves, and dependent on what we brought to the relationship, is untenable. It may seem obvious, though, that the task of the brain, what we have a brain for, is to put us in touch with whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves. But this conclusion is not quite as obviously right as it seems. Different aspects of the world come into being through the interaction of our brains with whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, and precisely which aspects come into being depends on the nature of our attention. It might turn out that for some purposes, those that involve making use of the world and manipulating it for our benefit, we need, in fact, to be quite selective about what we see. In other words, we might need to know what is of use to us, but this might be very different from understanding in a broader sense, and certainly might require filtering out some aspects of experience. Without experiencing whatever it is, we would have nothing on which to ground our knowledge, so we have to experience it at some stage, but in order to know it, we have to process experience. We have to be able to recognize what we experience, to say this is a such and such, that is, it has certain qualities that enable me to place it in a category of things that I have experienced before and about which I have certain beliefs and feelings. This processing eventually becomes so automatic that we do not so much experience the world as experience our representation of the world. The world is no longer present to us, but represented, a virtual world, a copy that exists in conceptual form in the mind. Much of our capacity to use the world depends not on an attempt to open ourselves as much as possible to apprehending whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, but instead on apprehending whatever I have brought into being for myself, my representation of it. This is the remit of the left hemisphere, and would appear to require a selective, highly focused attention. The right hemisphere is on the lookout. It has to be open to whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, as much as possible without preconceptions, not just focusing on what it already knows, or is interested in. This requires a mode of attention that is broader and more flexible than that of the left hemisphere. The conventional neuropsychological literature distinguishes 5 types of attention: vigilance, sustained attention, alertness, focused attention, and divided attention. While not identical, vigilance and sustained attention are similar, and they are often treated as one concept. Together with alertness, they form the basis of what has been called the intensity axis of attention. The other axis is selectivity, made up of the 2 remaining types, focused and divided attention. Experiments confirm that the different types of attention are distinct and independent of one another, and subserved by a number of different brain structures distributed extensively over the prefrontal, anterior cingulate, and posterior parietal areas of both hemispheric cortices. Clearly within either hemisphere, and possibly between hemispheres, the system of control processes is complex. However, some broad consistent differences in hemisphere specialization are striking when one comes to review the available evidence. Alertness and sustained attention, like vigilance, are the ground of our being in the world, not only at the lowest, vegetative level, but at the highest, spiritual levels. Brethren, be sober, be vigilant. Without alertness, we are as if asleep, unresponsive to the world around us. Without sustained attention, the world fragments. Without vigilance, we cannot become aware of anything we do not already know. Looking at the evidence from brain research, it becomes clear that vigilance and sustained attention are grossly impaired in subjects with right hemisphere lesions, especially right frontal lobe lesions. By contrast, in patients with left hemisphere lesions, therefore lying on their intact right hemisphere, vigilance is preserved. Patients with right hemisphere lesions also exhibit what is called perceptuometer slowing, a sign of diminished alertness, associated with lapses of attention. Studies in both healthy subjects and split-brain patients corroborate the role of the right hemisphere in the intensity aspects of attention, and scanning studies provide further confirmatory evidence of right hemisphere dominance in alertness and sustained attention. Overall, it appears clear that, of the 2 main axes of attention, intensity, alertness, vigilance, and sustained attention, is reliant on the right hemisphere. The other main axis of attention is selectivity, focused and divided attention. Turning to focused attention first, the story here is quite different. Deficits in focused attention are more severe with left hemisphere injury. Although selective attention may be bilateral, it is more typically associated with activity in the left quadrate or left anterior cingulate. Healthy subjects show a left hemisphere preference for choice reactions, and scanning studies suggest focused attention is associated with activity in the left orbitofrontal cortex and basal ganglia. As regards divided attention, the evidence is divided. While some studies suggest that both left and right hemispheres are involved, there appears to be a clear primary role for the right hemisphere, especially the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. To sum up, the right hemisphere is responsible for every type of attention except focused attention. Even where there is divided attention, and both hemispheres appear to be involved, it seems probable that the right hemisphere plays the primary role, possibly that of unifying the divided input. Because it is the right hemisphere that is responsible for attention globally, and because there is a natural tendency for each hemisphere to process preferentially stimuli from the contralateral attentional field, it is lesions in the right inferior parietal lobule that cause the most serious impairment of global attention. There have been suggestions that the basis for the right hemisphere predominance for attention may lie in the more sophisticated visuospatial processing of the right hemisphere, but I would be inclined to see that as a consequence of the attentional difference rather than a cause of it. The new versus the known. From this it follows that in almost every case what is new must first be present in the right hemisphere, before it can come into focus for the left. For one thing, the right hemisphere alone attends to the peripheral field of vision from which new experience tends to come. Only the right hemisphere can direct attention to what comes to us from the edges of our awareness, regardless of side. Anything newly entering our experiential world instantly triggers a release of noradrenaline mainly in the right hemisphere. Novel experience induces changes in the right hippocampus, but not the left. So it is no surprise that phenomenologically it is the right hemisphere that is attuned to the apprehension of anything new. This difference is pervasive across domains, not just new experience, but the learning of new information or new skills also engages right hemisphere attention more than left, even if the information is verbal in nature. However, once the skills have become familiar through practice, they shift to being the concern of the left hemisphere even for skills such as playing a musical instrument. If it is the right hemisphere that is vigilant for whatever it is that exists out there, it alone can bring us something other than what we already know. The left hemisphere deals with what it knows, and therefore prioritizes the expected. Its process is predictive. It positively prefers what it knows. This makes it more efficient in routine situations where things are predictable, but less efficient than the right wherever the initial assumptions have to be revised, or when there is a need to distinguish old information from new material that may be consistent with it. Because the left hemisphere is drawn by its expectations, the right hemisphere outperforms the left whenever prediction is difficult. The link between the right hemisphere and what is new or emotionally engaging exists not just in humans, but already in higher mammals. For example, horses perceive new and possibly emotionally arousing stimuli with the left eye. Possibility versus predictability. The right hemisphere is, in other words, more capable of a frame shift, and not surprisingly the right frontal lobe is especially important for flexibility of thought, with damage in that area leading to perseveration, a pathological inability to respond flexibly to changing situations. For example, having found an approach that works for one problem, subjects seem to get stuck, and will inappropriately apply it to a second problem that requires a different approach, or even, having answered one question right, will give the same answer to the next and the next. It is similar with problem solving. The right hemisphere presents an array of possible solutions, which remain alive while alternatives are explored. The left hemisphere, by contrast, takes the single solution that seems best to fit what it already knows and latches onto it. V.S. Ramachandran's studies of anosognosia reveal a tendency for the left hemisphere to deny discrepancies that do not fit its already generated schema of things. The right hemisphere, by contrast, is actively watching for discrepancies. These approaches are both needed, but pull in opposite directions. This difference is not predicated on any of the old distinctions such as verbal versus visuospatial. It operates equally in the realm of attention to verbal information. In keeping with what we know of its priorities, The left hemisphere actively narrows its attentional focus to highly related words while the right hemisphere activates a broader range of words. The left hemisphere operates focally, suppressing meanings that are not currently relevant. By contrast, the right hemisphere processes information in a non-focal manner with widespread activation of related meanings. Whereas close lexical semantic relationships rely more on the left hemisphere, looser semantic associations rely on the right. Because the right hemisphere makes infrequent or distantly related word meanings available, there is increased right hemisphere involvement when generating unusual or distantly related words, or novel uses for objects. This may be one of many aspects that tend to associate the right hemisphere with a freer, more creative style. The right anterior temporal region is associated with making connections across distantly related information during comprehension, and the right posterior superior temporal sulcus may be selectively involved in verbal creativity. In the closed situation, by contrast, the left hemisphere actively suppresses the right, to exclude associations which are semantically only distantly related. The more flexible style of the right hemisphere is evidenced not just in its own preferences, but also at the meta level, in the fact that it can also use the left hemisphere's preferred style, whereas the left hemisphere cannot use the right hemisphere's. For example, although the left hemisphere gains more benefit from a single strong association than several weaker associations, only the right hemisphere can use either equally. One of the standard psychological tests that is supposed to measure creativity is the remote association test, an expression of the belief that creativity requires the ability to make associations between widely different ideas or concepts. Since efforts of will focus attention and deliberately narrow its range, it may be that cessation of the effort to produce something, relaxation, in other words, favors creativity because it permits broadening of attention, and, with the expansion of the attentional field, engagement of the right hemisphere. From what has been said, it can be seen that relatively more remote or tenuous associations of thought are made more easily by permitting the broader scope of right hemisphere attention, which may also explain the tip of the tongue phenomenon. The harder we try, the more we recruit narrow left hemisphere attention, and the less we can remember the word. Once we stop trying, the word comes to us unbidden. Since the left hemisphere actually inhibits the breadth of attention that the right hemisphere brings to bear, creativity can increase after a left hemisphere stroke, and not just in sensory qualities but, as Alice Joanine says of one painter he describes, in numerous intellectual and affective components. Certainly there is plenty of evidence that the right hemisphere is important for creativity, which given its ability to make more and wider-ranging connections between things, and to think more flexibly, is hardly surprising. But this is only part of the story. Both hemispheres are importantly involved. Creativity depends on the union of things that are also maintained separately, the precise function of the corpus callosum, both to separate and connect. And interestingly, division of the corpus callosum does impair creativity. Integration versus division. In general, the left hemisphere is more closely interconnected within itself, and within regions of itself, than the right hemisphere. This is all part of the closed focus style, but it is also a reflection at the neural level of the essentially self, referring the nature of the world of the left hemisphere. It deals with what it already knows, the world it has made for itself. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, has a greater degree of myelination, facilitating swift transfer of information between the cortex and centers below the cortex, and greater connectivity in general. Functionally superior integration, by the more spread out overlapping sensory system and auditory inputs on the right side of the brain. I mentioned that new stimuli led to release of noradrenaline in the right hemisphere. Most neurons fatigue, that is to say they cease to respond, when continuously stimulated. These noradrenergic neurons do not fatigue, however, but maintain their condition of excitation, so that exploratory attention is held open across a greater expanse of both space and time. The range of the right hemisphere is further increased by the fact that it has a longer working memory, and so is able both to access more information and hold it together at any one time for longer. It is capable of bearing more information in mind and doing so over longer periods, with greater specificity, which also means less susceptibility to degradation over time by memory. This broader field of attention, open to whatever may be, and coupled with greater integration over time and space, is what makes possible the recognition of broad or complex patterns, the perception of the thing as a whole, seeing the wood for the trees. In short, the left hemisphere takes a local short-term view, whereas the right hemisphere sees the bigger picture. The hierarchy of attention. There are, then, two widely differing ways of attending the world. How do they relate to one another? If whatever is new to experience is more likely to be present in the right hemisphere, this suggests a temporal hierarchy of attention, with our awareness of any object of experience beginning in the right hemisphere, which grounds experience, before it gets to be further processed in the left hemisphere. This coexists with and is confirmed by a hierarchy of attention at any one moment in time, which also establishes the right hemisphere, not the left, as predominant for attention. Global attention, courtesy of the right hemisphere, comes first, not just in time, but takes precedence in our sense of what it is we are attending to. It therefore guides the left hemisphere's local attention, rather than the other way about. As an illustration, we would normally see the images here as an H, composed of E's, and a 4, composed of 8's. The exception to this is in schizophrenia, where the right hemisphere-dependent ability to see the whole at once is lost. Then the figure becomes just a mass of E's and 8's. One of the crucial differences in schizophrenia lies in the mode of attention, whereby the whole is built up from the parts. However, the attentional hierarchy can also be inverted in certain circumstances in normal individuals, when there is a high probability that what we are looking for lies at the local level. Our window of attention narrows, in order to optimize performance at this level, thus reversing the natural tendency to favor the global aspect. Essentially, the left hemisphere's narrow-focused attentional beam, which it believes it turns towards whatever it may be, has in reality already been seized by it. Therefore, it is the right hemisphere that has dominance for exploratory attentional movements, while the left hemisphere assists focused grasping of what has already been prioritized. It is the right hemisphere that controls where that attention is to be oriented. We do not have to orientate our attention to each feature of an object in turn to understand the overall object. The features are all present without the need to combine the products of focal attention. Beyond the difference in nature and extent of the attention that the two hemispheres give to the world, there is a fascinating and fundamental difference in their orientation. One might think that both hemispheres would take the world as a whole as their concern, or, if it is impossible for both to do so, that there would be a symmetrical and complementary distribution of attention across the whole field. But this is not the case, since the left visual field, and the perceptions of the left ear, are more available to the right hemisphere, and by the same token the right visual field, and the perceptions of the right ear to the left hemisphere, one would expect, and indeed one finds, a gradient of attention from left to right, or right to left, across the experiential world for either hemisphere. But these gradients are not symmetrical. There is a fundamental asymmetry of concern about the whole picture. The right hemisphere is concerned with the whole of the world as available to the senses, whether what it receives comes from the left or the right, it delivers to as a single complete world of experience. The left hemisphere seems to be concerned narrowly with the right half of space and the right half of the body, one part, the part it uses. In split-brain patients, For example, the right hemisphere attends to the entire visual field, but the left hemisphere only to the right. This refusal of the left hemisphere to acknowledge the left half of the world accounts for the fascinating phenomenon of hemi-neglect following a right hemisphere stroke, after which the individual is completely dependent on the left hemisphere to bring his body and his world into being. Because the concern of the left hemisphere is with the right half of the world only, the left half of the body, and everything lying in the left part of the visual field, fails to materialize. So extreme can this phenomenon be that the sufferer may fail to acknowledge the existence of anyone standing to his left, the left half of the face of a clock, or the left page of a newspaper or book, and will even neglect to wash, shave or dress the left half of the body, sometimes going so far as to deny that it exists at all. This is despite the fact that there is nothing at all wrong with the primary visual system. The problem is not due to blindness as ordinarily understood. If one temporarily disables the left hemisphere of such an individual through transcranial magnetic stimulation, the neglect improves, suggesting that the problem following right hemisphere stroke is due to release of the unopposed action of the left hemisphere. But you do not get the mirror image of the neglect phenomenon after a left hemisphere stroke, because in that case the still functioning right hemisphere supplies a whole body, and a whole world, to the sufferer. And, because the right hemisphere alone aids the extremities of the attentional field, whether left or right, where hemi-neglect results in loss of the left field, there is, extraordinarily enough, also loss of the extreme right field. There is a curious phenomenon of stickiness about the attention exhibited by the left hemisphere, which is related to its relative inflexibility referred to above. Following right hemisphere damage, the right hemifield seems to exert a magnetic attraction. Patients find their gaze pulled, despite themselves, towards the right, and it has even been suggested that the phenomenon of attentional hemi-neglect is not so much a matter of disregarding the left side of space, as of being captured by the right side of space, and unable to let go. The left hemisphere has difficulty disengaging, and this seems to be precisely because, instead of familiarity causing it to disengage, it causes it to engage all the more. Patients start off by being attracted towards items on the right, but then become stuck to them, because instead of causing inhibition, negative feedback, as would normally be the case, repeated or familiar stimuli on the right side cause facilitation, positive feedback. A patient of mine who had had a right hemisphere stroke following rupture of an arteriovenous malformation in his temporoparietal region would become fixated by inanimate objects in his right hemifield. If there was a door hinge to his right, for example, he would find himself waylaid by it as he tried to pass through the doorway, and get stuck inspecting it for protracted periods, unless actively disengaged by one of his carers. It is probably relevant that it is the right hemisphere that controls conjugate eye movements, that is, that makes the two eyes move together, leading to the interesting thought that it may be the right hemisphere that also keeps the hemispheres together, in the interests of a whole world of experience, rather than allowing the left hemisphere willfully to go its own way. In summary, the hierarchy of attention, for a number of reasons, implies a grounding role and an ultimately integrating role for the right hemisphere, with whatever the left hemisphere does at the detailed level needing to be founded on, and then return to, the picture generated by the right. This is an instance of the right, left, right progression which will be a theme of this book, and it lies at the very foundation of experience, attention, where the world actually comes into being. The whole versus the part. The link between the right hemisphere and holistic perception is one of the most reliable and durable of the generalizations about hemisphere differences, and that it follows from the differences in the nature of attention. The right hemisphere sees the whole, before whatever it is gets broken up into parts in our attempt to know it. Its holistic processing of visual form is not based on summation of parts. On the other hand, the left hemisphere sees part objects. The best-known example of this process of pattern perception is the way in which the Dalmatian dog, sniffing the ground in the shade of a tree, suddenly emerges from this mass of dots and splashes. The process is not a gradual putting together of bits of information, but an aha phenomenon. It comes all at once. The right hemisphere, with its greater integrative power, is constantly searching for patterns in things. In fact, its understanding is based on complex pattern recognition. Subjects with unilateral brain damage show deficits in drawing skills, depending on whether it is right or left hemisphere function that is compromised. The productions of those with right hemisphere damage, relying on their left hemisphere, lose overall coherence and integrity, and become so distorted they are barely recognizable. There is no grasp of the whole. For example, if asked to draw a person, subjects with right parietal occipital lesions exhibit considerable difficulty in assembling the various elements correctly, in their repeated attempts putting the limbs in extraordinary positions, arms attached to the neck or to the lower part of the trunk. One patient, asked to draw an elephant, draws only a tail, a trunk and an ear. Putting together a model of an elephant is no easier. It is done slowly and ends in a complete fiasco. Although, from what he says, he recognizes the essential elements, he is incapable of putting them in even approximately the right place or relation to one another. Figures become almost unbelievably simplified and distorted. A man, just a blob with 3 sticks for limbs. A bicycle, 2 small wheels positioned above the bigger pedals. A house reduced to a few chaotic lines, with a roof symbolized by an inverted V. The drawings of those with left hemisphere damage, by contrast, relying on their right hemisphere, sometimes exhibit relative poverty of detail, because the accent is on the shape of the whole. Because of the way in which the left hemisphere is biased towards identification by parts, and the right hemisphere towards the whole picture, they also differ in the way they understand what they experience. Context versus abstraction. For the same reason that the right hemisphere sees things as a whole, before they have been adjusted into parts, it also sees each thing in its context, as standing in a qualifying relationship with all that surrounds it, rather than taking it as a single isolated entity. Its awareness of the world is anything but abstract. Anything that requires indirect interpretation, which is not explicit or literal, that in other words requires contextual understanding, depends on the right frontal lobe for its meaning to be conveyed or received. The right hemisphere understands from indirect contextual clues, not only from explicit statement, whereas the left hemisphere will identify by labels rather than context. For example, identifies that it must be winter because it is January, not by looking at the trees. This difference is particularly important when it comes to what the two hemispheres contribute to language. The right hemisphere takes whatever is said within its entire context. It is specialized in pragmatics, the art of contextual understanding of meaning, and in using metaphor. It is the right hemisphere which processes the non-literal aspects of language, of which more later. This is why the left hemisphere is not good at understanding the higher-level meaning of utterances such as "it's a bit hot in here today," while the right hemisphere understands "please open a window." The left hemisphere assumes this is just helpful supply of meteorological data. It is also why the right hemisphere underpins the appreciation of humor, since humor depends vitally on being able to understand the context of what is said and done, and how context changes it. Subjects with right brain damage, like subjects with schizophrenia, who in many respects resemble them, cannot understand implied meaning, and tend to take conversational remarks literally. The left hemisphere, because its thinking is decontextualized, tends towards a slavish following of the internal logic of the situation. Even if this is in contravention of everything experience tells, this then is a weakness when it permits too ready a summary to theory. The left hemisphere is the hemisphere of abstraction, which, as the word itself tells us, is the process of taking things from their context. This, and its related capacity to categorize things once they have been abstracted, are the foundations of its intellectual power. Abstraction is necessary if the left hemisphere is to represent the world. The left hemisphere operates an abstract visual form system, storing information that remains relatively invariant across specific instances, producing abstracted types or classes of things. Whereas the right hemisphere is aware of and remembers what it is that distinguishes specific instances of a type, one from another. The right hemisphere deals preferentially with actually existing things, as they are encountered in the real world. Because its language roots things in the context of the world, it is concerned with the relations between things. Thus the right hemisphere does have a vocabulary. It certainly has a lexicon of concrete nouns and imageable words which it shares with the left hemisphere, but, more than that, perceptual links between words are made primarily by the right hemisphere. In general, abstract concepts and words, along with complex syntax, are left hemisphere dependent. But, once again, the right hemisphere's language inferiority depends to a significant degree on positive inhibition by the left hemisphere. If the left hemisphere is sufficiently distracted or incapacitated, the right hemisphere turns out to have a more extensive vocabulary, including long, unusual and non-imageable words. The contextual versus abstract distinction is illustrated by the different use of symbols by each hemisphere. In one sense of the word, a symbol such as the rose is the focus or center of an endless network of connotations which ramify through our physical and mental, personal and cultural, experience in life, literature and art. The strength of the symbol is in direct proportion to the power it has to convey an array of implicit meanings, which need to remain implicit to be powerful. In this it is like a joke that has several layers of meaning, explaining them destroys its power. The other sort of symbol could be exemplified by the red traffic light. Its power lies in its use, and its use depends on a one-on-one mapping of the command stop onto the color red, which precludes ambiguity and has to be explicit. This sort of symbolic function is in the realm of the left hemisphere, while the first type belongs to the realm of the right. In fact, a particularly important difference lies in the right hemisphere's capacity to understand metaphor. The right temporal region appears to be essential for the integration of two seemingly unrelated concepts into a meaningful metaphoric expression. Individuals versus categories. At the same time, it is the right hemisphere that has the capacity to distinguish specific examples within a category, rather than categories alone. It stores details to distinguish specific instances. The right hemisphere presents individual, unique instances of things and individual, familiar, objects, where the left hemisphere represents categories of things, and generic, non-specific objects. In keeping with this, the right hemisphere uses unique reference, where the left hemisphere uses non-unique reference. It is with the right hemisphere that we distinguish individuals of all kinds, places as well as faces. In fact, it is precisely its capacity for holistic processing that enables the right hemisphere to recognize individuals. Individuals are, after all, whole forms, that face, that voice, that gait, that sheer quiddity of the person or thing, defying analysis into parts. Where the left hemisphere is more concerned with abstract categories and types, the right hemisphere is more concerned with the uniqueness and individuality of each existing thing or being. The right hemisphere's role is what Ramachandran has described as the anomaly detector, might in fact be seen rather as an aspect of its preference for things as they actually exist, which are never entirely static or congruent, always changing, never the same. The right hemisphere is concerned with finer discriminations between things, whether living or non-living. Indeed, the cerebral principles of categorization take this into account in a remarkable way. What is general and what is specific are, after all, relative. Thus, characterizing an object as a car, or a piece of fruit, is general, but as to what variety of fruit, pear, or in particular which kind of pear, or what make of car, citron, particularly which model of citron, the matter is more specific. As the more subordinate categories become more individuated, they are recognized by the right hemisphere, whereas the left hemisphere concerns itself with the more general, superordinate categories. In keeping with this, despite the well-known right hemisphere advantage in dealing with the visuospatial, the left hemisphere is superior at identifying simple shapes and figures, which are easily categorized, whereas complex figures, being less typical, more individual, are better processed by the right hemisphere. The differences in sameness. An individual could be seen as a little universe, an infinite number of serial moments, experiences and perceptions, as the left hemisphere would see it, which are of course, at least as far as the right hemisphere is concerned, a single whole. Your wife or husband who left the house this morning may be in a different mood or have a different haircut by the evening, but this doesn't present a problem of identification, because these separate slices of experience, these separate frames of the film, as the left hemisphere would see it, are not really separate at all. They are the different aspects of one unique whole. But with certain right hemisphere deficits, the capacity for seeing the whole is lost, and subjects start to believe they are dealing with different people. They may develop the belief that a person they know very well is actually being represented by an imposter, a condition known, after its first describer, as Capgras syndrome. Small perceptual changes seem to suggest a wholly different entity, not just a new bit of information that needs to be integrated into the whole. The significance of the part, in this sense, outweighs the pull of the whole. Fascinatingly, right hemisphere deficit syndromes can result in something which looks like the opposite, the belief that someone one knows is duplicated in different places at different times. Not, in other words, the division of a unique whole, but the mass reproduction of one. Something personal and usually alive has been duplicated as if it were a mere item on an assembly line, according to John Cutting, with loss of uniqueness and familiarity. A patient of mine accused her husband of two-timing because she believed she saw him on several occasions with different women while she was out in the town shopping, at times when she knew he should have been at work. This curious condition is called Fregoli syndrome, after an Italian quick-change artist of the early 1900s. Here the fine discrimination of individuals supplied by the right hemisphere is lost, and different individuals are lumped together and again represented in a category. It is not the opposite of the Capgras syndrome, but a natural consequence of the same cause, a loss of the sense of a unique whole. Such delusional misidentification applies not only to people, but to objects. Another patient of mine began a vendetta against someone who, she believed, had entered her bedroom and subtly changed all her clothes for copies of a slightly inferior quality. It can even apply to places. One individual held that there were 8 imposter cities, duplicating his own, and said he had spent the last 8 years wandering between them, without finding the real one. There were also 8 duplicates of his wife and children, each duplicate living in a separate duplicate city with a double of the patient. Overall, then, and in keeping with the principle that it is not what is done, but how it is done, that distinguishes the two hemispheres, one cannot say that one hemisphere deals with single items, units, and the other with aggregates. Both deal with units and both deal with aggregates. Thus the right sees individual entities, units, and it sees them as belonging in a contextual whole, an aggregate, from which they are not divided. By contrast, the left sees parts, units, which go to make up a something which it recognizes by the category to which it belongs, an aggregate. However, the relationship between the smaller unit and the broader aggregate in either case is profoundly different, as is the mode of attention to the world with which it is associated.